जीवन है कुछ करना है तो कर गुजरो हर लम्हा एक सपना है क्या जाने अपना हो ना हो गम को हमेशा मुस्कुरा के छुपाना हंस के हंसा के जिंदगी को बिताना रुकने न पाए सिलसिला जो चला है देखो न बिखरे काफिला जो बना है रुकने न पाए सिलसिला जो चला है देखो न बिखरे काफिला जो बना है Whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Assalamu alaikum.
It was Dopal Ka Jeewan where he changed that intro part, right? Ooh, ah, ooh, ah, oh. That was Dopal Ka Jeewan.
In the live, yeah.
Yeah, in the live version.
Oh.
And then they paid homage to that in the Pepsi Battle of the Bands ad
Yep, they did for the last season. Correct.
for last season. Yeah.
Welcome back, guys. Another episode of season 2. I'm Omer.
And I'm Hamad.
And Ali Qazi.
Kya haal hai bhai? How's it going?
It's going well. Excited to keep talking and continue on from previous episodes.
And I like to think that there's a reason why we always pick these songs to start off with, and we ended here with Rukne na paaye silsila jo chala hai dekho na bikhre Qafila jo bana hai.
Oof.
And in for me, the way that I read this is, at least in our context, is Vital Signs really started something that was
Started a Qafila.
yeah, it was indelible, right? I mean, it has a reverberating impact that cannot be measured. And that's what we're here to talk about, is what exactly was Vital Signs' legacy? What was their impact? Not just musically, but also on Pakistani society, Pakistani culture. And so where did it all start?
I want to actually want to. We were having an argument about like their.
We keep the arguments off air.
I mean, we may have done that a little bit over. I'm going to kind of pick up from that, and I think we were talking about their sound, and and it kind of ties into what kind of impact they've had on people and as well as performers, and not performers that are kind of like popular. I'm talking about just general guys like us who like to play music and like to go out there and perform. So the point that I was trying to make is, when I was discouraging you guys to kind of box their sound, is that they're very multidimensional, and they've had an impact on people of different generations and different genres. Like, we established that, right? And in what way though? And then the point that I wanted to make is, so anytime you come out as a performer, right, there's a certain brand that you have, right? So for example, what is us? What are we? Well, like I'm Junoon. That's my brand. That's like my identity. Like, if I go out there, I want to be known as like, this guy plays Junoon's music, right? So I think, and then so when we take ownership, like when I look at Junoon, I'm like, this is my ish. I own this, right? I tried to do that with Vital Signs, and I failed. And I tell you how that happened. There's a couple of people that I've performed with who kind of belong to different genres or different brands, right? So I know this guy who does Bollywood karaoke singing. Right? He does a lot of Atif Aslam, Rahat Fateh, and all this type of music, right? And then when we come to talk about Vital Signs, he's like, "Yaar, ye gana jo hai na, ye main college ke zamane mein karta tha is tarah." So that hit me. I was like, wow. So this guy has that nostalgic connection. And then I jammed with him. On, Tum Dur The To Kya Hua, Do Pal Ka Jeewan Chehra, and some of these first album songs, right? Similarly, there's another guy that I know who I played with, who's more of the 80s keyboard, sort of that Ali Heather type of genre. And, he likes to do songs by Alamgir, Shaky, Ali Heather, Nazia Zohaib. And when he comes to play Vital Signs songs, he plays it like he owns Vital Signs. And I'm thinking, like, no, Vital Signs is mine. But then it's not. And when when they come out to play, there's a certain Vital Signs songs that he goes towards. More like, Samli Saloni, Gore Rang Ka Zamana, maybe Wo Kaun Thi.
The crowd pleasers.
Yeah. When I go to Vital Signs, there's certain songs that I pick out. More specifically, like the deeper, harder tracks, Ye Zami, Namumkin, Main Chup Raha, Khamosh Ho. Those are my Vital Signs. So that was my whole point. Like, Vital Signs are multidimensional. Like, nobody owns Vital Signs. Everybody owns Vital Signs. Like, not one, like, us sitting here, we own Junoon. That's our thing. Right? But nobody can say that, oh, I own Vital Signs. This is my ish. You know what I mean? So that's what I was trying to get at. And I think that's, when you talk about their impact, they have a multi-dimensional impact. They've had an impact on freaking everybody. As, all these other performers that have come up from every generation. Or, you look at Pepsi Battle of the Bands right now, people are coming, kids that were probably not even born when Vital Signs broke up, right? When Hum Tum album came out, they probably weren't even born. They're coming out and singing Vital Signs.
Right.
So
yeah, so they had a lasting impact on the scene. There's no doubt about it. Omer, do you have any thoughts on?
I mean, yeah, to Ali's point, not just multi-dimensional, multi-generational too. We were just talking to a friend of ours, and he got introduced to Vital Signs from his parents, and
which is remarkable.
In the previous episode, we were talking about how our uncles, mamus, and chachas, were listening, and we were younger kids, and they were older, maybe similar to age.
But that's not the first time I've heard somebody who's in their late 20s and early 30s that said that I heard Vital Signs from my parents.
Right. Junoon, like just for comparison, since those are the two biggest bands of Pakistan, success-wise, Junoon, you can just stick to one generation and say, yeah, this is the Junooni generation, and the parents will be like, oh no, Junoon's no good, and the kids are like, yeah, go Junoon. But Vital Signs, on the other hand, so many dimensions to it that they were able to connect to a variety of people.
Not initially though. Like, I remember when they came out, there were people who were more listening to Bollywood and stuff. Like, इनका music बहुत तेज है, इनका बहुत loud है, बहुत fast है.
Yeah, that was the ghazal type listeners, the golden.
Not even ghazal, it's like typical filmy listening.
I mean, the filmy music could be fast paced and dance stuff too,
but back then the music quality of music was much, especially Bollywood, was very lagging. It was like they weren't using the equipment that later came in. That, and as a matter of fact, when we were talking about impact, I don't think anybody from across the border is actually going to recognize this, but. When you look at the timeline of the sound changing in Bollywood, you have this sort of Amir Khan generation that comes up, and if you guys heard the songs from the like Pehla Nasha, right?
Right.
If you listen to the sound quality of that song versus sound quality of some of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, world of difference, right? So I would love to think that what we were doing in Pakistan at that time had something to do with that, because the pop sound, the kind of keyboards and electronic music that was getting introduced in Pakistan was now going across the border. I like to think that Vital Signs had that impact. And Vital Signs, I mean, the Bollywood did steal their songs. There's several songs that Bollywood stole of Vital Signs. Samli Saloni,
absolutely,
Yaaron, Dil Pakistan was stolen. I've seen the video for Dil Hindustan, Jan Jan Hindustan, believe it or not.
So yeah, I mean the impact is across generations. It's across different genres. People, Vital Signs had hard rock songs like the one we started with, Dopal Ka Jeewan, right, with hard licks, hard guitar sounds, and then they had a lot of poppy sounds too, like the UB40 song that they copied, Samjhana.
Well,
right?
Junaid Jamshed actually said that that's what their intention was, to introduce reggae.
Right.
But actually, it was kind of a cheap knockoff.
I think he got his wish with his Ab Jeewan Ajay.
Ab Jeewan Ajay was much closer.
It actually had real reggae in it, instead of just the reggae sound. But yeah, I mean, so you're talking about a time where the kind of music, or the way the music was enjoyed back then was, everything was proper and in its place, prim and proper, right? You sit down. You enjoy, you clap. Nobody moves around, even on stage. It's like they're kind of like the Elvis of their time. If you guys know how Elvis was perceived, and this guy comes on stage, shaking his hips and moving the way that nobody has ever done on stage before.
Right.
And the entire society was shaken by it. And I think that's the way that these guys were doing. And Vital Signs weren't the only ones. Junaid Jamshed wasn't the only one acting like this, but that cohort, Ali Azmat was part of it as well. The way they came on stage, their stage presence had the similar impact. So our parents and that generation was like, Toba Toba, what are these guys doing? This is not a way to behave. This is not prim. This is not proper. But the youngsters...
Even though there were Pakistani artists that were actually doing that.
Sure.
Outside of pop as well.
Right.
I mean, I remember looking at watching variety shows where, a female singer would come and sing an Indian song and dance to it too. And
yeah, so that's the maybe I don't know if there's
it was changing of
a
the
double
times.
standard to this or not, because filmy music always has a certain thing to it, attributed to it, that yes, there's maybe there's a behuda dance involved, and that's allowed. That's
It's
okay
known.
because this is film.
You
This is how the
expect it
film.
from
Yeah,
it.
but you don't expect this from somebody on the stage singing, just a pop song, like a youngster, right?
Sure.
Just coming up, a college graduate, an engineer like Junaid Jamshed. Was he electrical engineer, some sort of engineer?
which was a big deal as well, because when these guys came out, as a matter of fact, I know Hamad wanted to talk about the. I'll segue this into the political climate of that time. According to their own narrative, Junaid, Vital Signs comes out in '88. Elections happen. Benazir's there. Benazir Bhutto actually called these guys over. I don't know if you know the story. She actually called these guys over and told them that we want you guys to be the kind of the representatives of
Face of the youth of
face of
Pakistan.
the youth
Yeah.
of the new generation, because they were different. They were, Salman Ahmad was a doctor. Junaid Jamshed, mechanical engineer. Ruhail Hayat was an engineer too.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe Shahi dropped out or something, and these guys were like, equal. They were talking in English a lot of the times, which was kind of, a lot of the working class people were really relating to it. So that was another stigma.
Yeah,
on them.
I mean, there's definitely a divide, right? I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that this was I wouldn't say this is a product of elite urban Pakistani culture. This is very much a product of like the middle class, the rising middle class. Even during the 1970s
I
under
like the way you
Zia's.
say rising middle class, because definitely they're not. I mean, like
Yeah,
you said,
because
they're
there
not
were
the
some
least
there were some
elite.
economic transformations that occurred in the 1970s and
Right.
80s in Pakistani society. One thing that I think is really interesting though, and I have to credit writers like Nadeem Farooq Paracha, who have written extensively on these topics, and there are others as well who have documented this history. Is that he talks about how Western pop influences and rock and jazz influences, which Vital Signs actually has some jazz and sort of like obviously kind of the 80s like synthesizer mixes,
Right.
but a lot of the Goan Christian communities, which we've talked about before, that was actually exclusively their domain in Karachi and Lahore, right? Centers like that. And eventually that then seeped into the ways in which this rising middle class like urban youth actually took on these forms of music, and then kind of disseminated them for broader audiences.
Right.
And in many ways, I mean, at the time, the reality is that Goan Christian communities in Karachi especially were really beginning to take on this sort of new rock and roll and kind of jazz vibe. The patrons and the consumers of that product were in fact Muslims, right?
Right.
But it wasn't the masses in ways in which Vital Signs was able to connect with them.
Yeah.
And so this actually brings me to one of the
This can't
impacts.
help making more and more parallels to the Beatles, because you know how Beatles
Right.
took black music and brought it to the mainstream. Isn't kind of the same where these
Well, I mean,
guys are
yeah,
taking
that's
that
right. Because
Christian
I mean,
music,
but they did it through a white medium. I mean, essentially the
yeah.
reason why, and this there's I mean, even Elvis, right? I mean, Elvis took so many sort of black church southern influences and essentially presented it in forms that were acceptable because it was racially acceptable.
Right,
And so
right.
yeah, you touch on a very important point, I think, in Pakistani
because
political
obviously,
history.
like this, in the same way,
Right.
the Goan Christian.
It's one thing
performers-
for like Christian artists to come up and like try to become mainstream, and they're just
Exactly.
not going to be the same way
Right.
in a Sunni hegemonic society, right?
Right,
Like, and then
right.
you have these middle class urban Muslim
This-
youth.
I've never thought of it that way.
Junaid
This
and
is the
Ruhail
first
and-
time.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
eye opening.
Yeah. So I guess that touches on one thing that you touched on briefly in the last episode about the unifying factor that Vital Signs and other bands were able to present, right?
Yeah.
And through not just songs like Dil Dil Pakistan, but Hum Hai Pakistani Hum To Jeetenge, which
Right.
coincided with the '96 World Cup.
Ye Zameen.
Maula was released for the 50th sort of Jubilee of Pakistan in
Right.
1997. Ye Zameen, right? And so these songs really were able to present a more unifying vision at a time where ethnic strife was in fact quite rampant, and to some
Quite
degree it
rampant.
still is.
That's an
But
understatement.
I wanna ask you both. I mean, you know, we're not experts of Pakistan when it comes to sort of its political dynamics or its identity, but I've actually seen that the younger generations of Pakistan today do in fact kind of have this more pehchan, this identity that is Pakistani, and not, you know, I am Urdu speaking first, or, you know, Punjabi or Gujarati or whatever first, that I am. And I wonder what you all think, you know, bands like Vital Signs, what kind of role they had to play.
I think it's twofold. You have, on one hand, as generations progress, some of those ideas dilute a little bit, whereas
They become more distant from those histories.
Exactly. So, you know, where you had your parents were the ones that migrated, for example, then your proximity, you know, is direct to that time, to that era. So you're going to be maybe divided along those lines, that we were already here or you migrated, whatever the case may be. And then on top of that, on the second hand, I think Vital Signs, what they did, and specifically what Junaid Jamshed did, and I think I respect something about him a lot, and he said this in interviews many times, that he loves Pakistan. Okay, somebody with his caliber, with his talent, with his world appeal all around the globe, he could have, and a lot of artists did, and he could have moved anywhere. You know, leave Pakistan, live in America, live in the UK, do whatever he wants. But he always used to say, "I love Pakistan," and I would rather, you know,
Isn't
not
that
be-
remarkable?
yeah.
Though he's like the embodiment of his message and
exactly.
his songs.
And
It's not,
so he talked the talk, he walked the walk, and it came up in his songs.
Yeah.
Right. So Hum Hai Pakistani, Dil Dil Pakistan, Ye Zameen, Maula, Tu Hai Kahan, or all those songs that he was part of. Even the military ones, Unchi and you know, all the Milli Naghme, that showed. And I think that impact, at least for me, I can say personally, really connects me to that identity. That, you
Well,
know,
and
it
you know
helps.
why I think it's important. I think it's important because anybody who knows the history of Pakistan knows that there's always, I think, been an identity crisis, right? There's always been an identity crisis of who we are, what it means to be Pakistani, what is the meaning of Pakistan, why was it created? You know, these are all in sort of, frankly, eternal and unanswerable questions, I think. But also specifically, I mean, you talk about 1971, you know, the country divided, right?
right.
And that left this sort of like vacuum, right? To say, you know, who are we? You know, how do we sort of assert our identity? And I think that on the sort of, not just, I mean, I wouldn't say global level, because I think, you know, frankly, because of Western, exceptionalism in so many ways, people don't really care much about the subcontinent much. But I think when we talk about regionally, right? I mean, frankly, there are a few faces off the top of my head that I can think about that represented Pakistan, certainly regionally, right? Certainly when it came to the subcontinent. Those were people like Imran Khan, artists like Nazia Hassan,
Nusrat Fateh Ali.
Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. You had Mehdi Hassan, you
Right.
know, and then you had Junaid Jamshed,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you had Junaid Jamshed. And you know, I think you touched on a very good point, Adi Bhai, is that, you know, I've always considered that Pakistan has created just, I mean, frankly, it's a standard bearer, I think, in the subcontinent when it comes to pop and rock music. And then you have sort of the filmy genre, which by the way, I mean, there are intersections. I mean, Pakistan's film industry was declining,
Yeah.
but towards the end of it, with hits like Coco Corina, for instance, which was a very sort of like Western kind of like,
70s.
yeah, but a very Western kind of infused like
Right.
melody and tone to it. There was a pop element that was emerging. Alamgir was a playback singer, and then
Yeah,
he
I mean,
eventually
the
had a
pop
solo.
elements were
Right, so
way-
they were already
like,
being
Vital Signs
planted,
did not
right? Yeah.
create that.
But what I mean to say is, like, I think it was really important at that time, especially for Pakistan to really have a face that represented its youth. And I think
You know,
it connects to the
personally-
story that you said, Benazir. I mean, because politicians recognize that. Politicians recognize the value in that, and there's a reason why they probably elevated a band like Vital Signs the way that they did.
You know, on a personal level, like since this is around the same time we had migrated to the US, right? So it was so nice to have a Desi music which was cool.
All right.
Because Desi music, like, you know, you're here in LA, you got, you know, hip hop is coming up and you're listening to all this stuff. And how are you gonna go from that to, you know, like
And I will say that
Anil
there's and,
Kapoor's movies? And,
you know how they say that there's each nation or each people kind of has its own identity and ethos, right? And its personality, I suppose. In Vital Signs and these other bands that emerged, but certainly Vital Signs, right? We can take them as an example. What's really wonderful, I think, is that it was real, and it
Yeah.
was kind of raw, right? And it was
Yeah.
youthful as well.
'Cause
It-
they were innocent
look,
themselves. They didn't
this
know
is
what
not
they were
this is not a
doing.
show where we're kind of bash on Bollywood. I mean, obviously, I think people can
not?
already tell our biases.
yeah.
But and obviously Bollywood has had tremendous contributions, whatever you want to say. But I think there's like there's a dreamy and escapist quality, right? An escapist quality to Bollywood and that genre. That's what it's designed to do. Is it's designed to make you escape from reality. But it is. I mean, it frankly is, right? But when it comes to Vital Signs, that was like, look, this is how I feel, right?
Right. Yeah.
वो
It talks to
वो
you.
क्या गाना है वो लाइन में कि तुम्हारा और मेरा
Yeah, that's Junaid Jamshed's solo album, but yeah, you
Right?
get the
Sorry, okay, my bad. Well, we're verging into other territory. But my point is that, like, there's darker elements to the
Yeah.
music and to the lyrics that aren't quite presented in other, at least to my knowledge, mainstream subcontinent genres.
I mean,
but,
the song Hum Tum, and you talked about the
Right.
political strife, and the song Hum Tum was written for, 94, 95, when
Yeah.
Karachi was just,
yeah,
in
burning.
burning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Junoon had made Iltija for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
Shoaib Mansoor had wrote Hum Tum song, and it's such a potent ke Ajnabi rahenge kya,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
absolutely.
Din ba din ek junoon jo
So
बढ़े
I
जा
will say,
रहा है.
I had this thought in my head, so I'm just gonna, interject it right now. Is that, of course, there was a unifying factor with all of these sort of, and I think two things. One, and we should acknowledge this as well, is that, we come from a particular ethnic sort of background, and we have our own kind of blind spots to a certain degree. I've actually loved when, even the song Challa, but other bands have come out with songs in Punjabi. They've mixed in, sort of other languages, Pashto, etc. That I think reflects the beauty of Pakistan. But there's no doubt, obviously, Vital Signs in many ways was a very Urdu-centric sort of like lyrical
But they still covered
band.
a lot of culture.
They did. They did. They did. There's no doubt.
Jamni hot
Right.
sarai ki bole.
Right, true. Although that is almost, again, my critique is going to come out that that's somewhat of a fetishization of like that ethnicity. But I hear you. But I do want to
Well,
say,
you
I
just say I'm Diwane Multan ke, right? So,
हाँ ये भी ठीक है लेकिन again that's another urban kind of like projection of like how we sort of what's it called fantasize about rural sort of like notions of beauty and things like that जो उनके गानों में बहुत था शहर के बाजार में गाँव की
which
कुछ
was not. I
लड़कियाँ
think that was in the purpose for that song was entirely different. It wasn't about like identifying the beauty characteristics of anybody's beauty.
so we were
I
going to
think
get into
it
that.
was in Dil Dhunta Hai How.
Right, we were going to get into that, but
Gaano
one
mera
final
dhooniye
thing, one final note
baaliyan.
that I want to mention is that the I remember thinking this myself, and this was 1997. I was quite young, but what I did know early on is I did toil with this idea of like what is Pakistan, and so when Maula came out,
Yeah.
and I get it, Maula is it's a generic term, right? It's a
Right.
generic term, but it did have very Islamic kind of undertones to it, and to me, like the fact that it marked the 50th anniversary of Pakistan, which is a country that for me, yes, I mean, of course, it's a homeland for Muslims of a certain kind of South Asian Muslim,
Right.
but for me, I was starting to discover these ideas of like, wait a minute, there are Christian populations in Pakistan.
Oh, I see what
There are
you mean.
Hindu
Is it-
populations in Pakistan.
I think it
And-
kind of goes back to your poem about Pakistan ka matlab kya la ilaha illallah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so, for me, it was, I don't know. I
How do you
still
accommodate
remember being a
minorities in
little
that?
bit,
Right.
I don't know. I was a little
लेकिन
unsettled by
मौला
the fact
song
that there
जो है
was
ना,
this
मौला song is
religious
such a
element to
personal
it.
dua.
Hmm?
Mawla song is such a personal dua. I mean, you
Right,
you,
right,
you
right.
listen to it right
Yeah.
now and you think of Junaid Jamshed and his whole कि अमन मोहब्बत के दिन दे दे हमने है लंबी रात गुजारी, like कब तक हम
Right.
लोग गुजरेंगे
Yeah.
इससे
We're
मेहनत
steeped
से,
in darkness. We really
right?
need to like.
कोई
Yeah.
किसी का हक ना मारे जीने दे और
Right,
जी ले
right,
सारे, right?
It was a social justice sort of oriented song. There's
Yeah.
no doubt about it. But
I think it was
yeah.
more of a plea, like
Right.
Ya Allah, just deliver us,
Right.
make our
Right.
country into a jannat.
No, that's a really
Yeah.
Jannat Bana De.
Because
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
cover that song sometimes. I get emotional singing that, you know,
Yeah.
because like really, man, just and this is '90s, late '90s, and things have only gotten worse since then. So.
Right. Yeah, because the sectarian differences have gotten deeper, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, so let's go to this. You were talking earlier off air about kind of notions of beauty and
So Shoaib Mansoor, I think,
yeah.
personally, because it's in some of his other works too, like एक गाना Shoaib Mansoor का आया था वो अनारकली वगैरह का. So he has that kind of reverence to, you know, tradition, and especially the traditional beauty, right? So you can see a lot of that in the song Dil Dhunta Hai, right? Which is kind of like, I mean, these are 90s songs, and you know, things have changed. Like society is a lot more modern now compared to then, and he's complaining about what's going on in the 90s. So you can see where his mind is. He probably goes back to the 70s or something. I don't know.
Isn't that the song where it goes Dil dhundta hai wohi
वही ज़माना
zamana
जिसका सुना हमने,
jiska suna humne, and then
देखा
there's a girl who comes in and she says, "My foot, you idiot,"
Yeah.
or something like that,
She's
right?
like, I just can't stand him. He wants me to marry him. My foot.
right,
You know?
right.
So I mean, what does he say? Like, सावन के झूले गए, मेहंदी की रातें गई, छुप छुप के खत लिए. All those things that used to take place in kind of, you know, that, you know, a romantic pyar.
But it was a very male-oriented kind of notion of like what is romance, right? And
right.
and to some degree, I mean, this is one of my pushbacks as well. And of course, everybody knows that there was a little bit of colorism that played out. This is very famous. Everybody knows about this. कि गोरे रंग का ज़माना कभी हो गया पुराना. उसके बाद हड़तालें हुई, और you know lots of no, I mean, well, not literally, but like, you know,
yeah.
questions arose and things, you know, and then eventually they came out with Samni Sononi. I'm not sure like how much longer after, but there was a very I don't know if misogynistic is kind of maybe too strong. I'm not sure if it is.
I mean, it wasn't considered.
Tell us in
like,
comments what you think. But yeah, I mean, to some extent, there was this idea of like romanticizing this concept of like how a female Pakistani
I
should
think
be and perform her identity.
Pakistani society in general was not as screwed up in terms of, you know, women as it is now. Like the kind of things that take place now.
Okay.
I think
That's an
women
interesting
were
take.
respected a lot more back then than they are now.
Huh.
In terms of objectification of women. क्योंकि फिर generations change, and you know, Bollywood introduced all these things.
But how much of it was that? How much of that was a product of the fact that they were relatively repressed? There was
they've
more.
always been repressed.
Well, I mean,
It's a
yeah, but
patriarchal
I'm not saying that
society.
that's not the case now. But I think women in Pakistan have, to some degree, seen a liberalization. So
Yeah.
there's more of a backlash now. Whereas
Yeah,
before they were sort of like, "हाँ ठीक है घर में रहती हैं, ठीक है."
Right. So that
You know,
played
so there
an
wasn't
effect
that
of-
much
but
of a
like,
backlash because there didn't really need to be,
Yeah.
right? So.
Yeah, no, you're right.
But yeah, I mean, you know, those issues aside, there's no doubt that I think, you know, obviously Vital Signs lyrically left a great impression, and I think there was, I have to say that I always found that interesting, this sort of contrast that was always drawn between urban society as seen as complex. So let's say that like let's take the most
it's
liberal
all in the song. In
right.
Sheher
So
Ke Bazaar.
right.
That
let's,
is a
let's-
juxtaposition of
Exactly.
urban society and rural.
let's take the most liberal approach that we can, or the most generous approach that we can, without getting into like, you know, interpretations of whether it was engaging in misogyny or whatever. But there was this like juxtaposition that was it's drawn out in many songs. In fact, I'm not sure what other examples we might be able to draw, but you know, where there was like this you know, characterization of the urban centers as complex, complicated, unnecessarily complicated, and sort of heavy with the baggage and things like that, and the simplicity of rural life,
Right,
right?
sadgi,
The simplicity of and I think
Nazuk si
Yadiya,
kalai,
right,
savli, right?
and
all this stuff.
Yadiya to some extent was also.
Oh yeah.
And but I think ultimately this pushes back against the unity sort of thing.
Okay.
Do you see what I'm getting at? Is that I'm not going to say there were two Pakistans or multiple Pakistans, right? And that's reflected in the juxtaposition that is being drawn, because I think that these urban middle and upper middle class youth were actually really fascinated by what they saw outside of these major cities, right?
Okay.
And they kind of wanted to draw that difference out, but at the same time, obviously, sort of, there was a unifying factor, but it also shows that there are these different elements of Pakistan that we really often don't talk about, right?
So
They covered it in their
to,
songs.
to your point though, I think in general as a society, there is a romanticization of the rural.
Across all societies.
Even here, in country songs about
Country roads,
country road,
you know.
hillsides, and
Right.
and the plains and so on and so forth. And even in Pakistan, I think
Yeah.
it just it reminds you of a simpler time, I suppose.
Yeah.
Supposedly, I mean, it's probably not in the
Well, there's
in
something
modern,
metaphysical. Your heart and
Right.
soul is more connected to natural things.
Of course,
So-
but I'm just saying it's a romantic notion, and that's all it really is.
Yeah.
That thinking back to a simpler time when it's really probably not simple at all. I mean, we're a global village now, and everything is connected, and even the rural places have the same issues
Cell
and
phones.
problems as the
Or
They-
are
they got
impacted
Facebook
by
there.
Yeah.
those issues that are playing out in the urban centers.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. So, but I think that's what they were kind of playing on, was that same notion, and I think it's universal, really.
Ajay, I want to drive a little bit towards musical impact on Vital Signs' musical impact on the industry itself. And I think I kind of, in one of the episodes that we did on Vital Signs, I talked about how they are the seeds. And I even claimed that Junoon comes out of Vital Signs.
I mean, to some extent, Salman Ahmed, right? Obviously being in the
Salman
first album,
Ahmed,
and
Nusrat Hussain were both part of Vital Signs.
right.
And Ali Azmat was the guy who was always hanging out with Vital Signs. As a matter of fact, when Salman Ahmed was breaking up, Ali Azmat was right there in the building. Right? So it all kind of happened right there. It all came out of that process of Vital Signs.
Right.
Then what happens
And
is
then you have artists like Asad Ahmed.
they go through, Karwan comes out.
He was obviously involved with the Humtum album and brought his
Definitely.
flair to it, and
Yeah.
I'm sure took something from it.
And
So-
then individual members, they go on, Shahzad Hassan creates the biggest studio and everybody's going there to record. He's an institution himself. He does Pepsi Battle of the Band Season 1 with Rohel Hayat. So
Hayat
that
does
kicks
Coke
off the Pepsi
Studio.
franchise.
Yep.
Rohel Hayat goes on to create Coke Studio after that. Junaid Jamshed at the same time. Junaid Jamshed's religious career, which we should discuss in detail, I think we owe that. But it's a
Shahid Ramzan
phenomenon of its own, because he becomes a bigger global figure in that.
A
in
sort
a-
of
in a strange
pan-Islamic
way.
figure.
In
Yeah.
a pan-Islamic, so you have people that are like Arabs in South Africa, for example, or Canada, that know about Junaid Jamshed.
Right.
Like we talked about when we were talking about Junoon and when they played at Isna, Salman and Junaid, the Native Deen, which is the African American Islamic rap group here, they were performing with Junaid Jamshed singing Dil Pakistan. So Junaid Jamshed's career comes out of, so all these things are coming out of Vital Signs, right?
So here's a question. So obviously, Vital Signs were not the only band. They were not the first band of Pakistan, right? There were several bands. A lot of them never made it, never got a label, never got signed. Vital Signs were probably the first band to sign with a major label, right? As a 4 or 5 piece band.
And there's a
and-
good reason for that.
And I think they're probably the first to introduce the beverage sponsorship into the music scene too, right? Now we have
and all other music videos.
right. So now we have several, and they sold out Dil Pakistan, right? It became Pepsi Pakistan for that one
Right.
big long commercial. So I
And we
think,
should talk about that, the BBC thing.
right. And so this whole now we have several beverages involved. Coke being the most. Pepsi's back. Nescafe's
Nescafe.
in.
Not just beverages, but
Kuch ruah afza ka bhi
strepsils.
kuch
Yeah,
aa raha hai
now we
isme.
got sore throat, cough drops. We have cell phone companies, youth
Strepsils.
records, we have all sorts of other things going. But I think they were able to reel that fish in with Pepsi, and then after that, nothing really happened. But I think the seed was planted,
The seed was definitely planted.
right? And so people saw the potential that, okay, Coke can come back in, Nescafe can come, all these others. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of talent, right?
I mean,
Another,
I remain I remain quite critical actually of the fact that
what else is new?
good one. No. I mean, I hope that I think you'll appreciate this.
Yeah.
The fact that, look, I grew up as you did, loving, and really connecting with these bands, right? And these and not only that, but I mean, I think for me, the fact that these were relatable stories,
Right.
right?
Right.
These individual stories that they had of, I think you've talked about the story before, where Rohel Hayat got on a bike and he heard about the singer in Pindi,
Yeah.
right? And he's like, ठीक है चलते हैं यार उसको देख के आते
I
हैं कि
probably
क्या-"
read it off of a Nadeem Farooq Pracha.
Perhaps you did, but you mentioned it before in a previous episode. And for me, it's like, when I was growing up, to me, because my parents were sort of constantly, as they should have, and as alhamdulillah, I'm very, very glad that they did, they kept hammering in me this idea that, look, you need to focus on your education, you need to do something with your life, blah, 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 etc. And that's exactly the context that these guys come out of, right? I mean, these guys were studying engineering. Salman Ahmed was studying in med school, right? I mean, they were pursuing these, but then at the same time, they had these other passions. Now, granted, they were supremely talented, and it was fate that they were going to be who they were. But for me, that was what was so relatable about them. And now we have a situation where, you don't have these sort of like stories of like these artists just getting together and being like, look, let's just play at home and, see what we can come up with.
Yeah.
And then
And that's
being,
what they probably did.
and
As
being-
a matter
and
of fact,
that's what
if
they
you,
did, right?
if you look at the first version of Chehra Miratan, have you seen that?
I have not.
It's on YouTube. I'll show that to you.
It's raw.
It's very raw.
Yeah.
It's very funny.
Yeah.
It's not tight sounding at all.
It's not.
Right.
So I'm just
And
wondering,
there's
like,
there's a similar video of Ali Noor in his bedroom, right? Just like hanging out, like
Oh, really?
jamming out on his guitar, like jumping on a bed, right? Like he's a
Wow.
teenager, but he's got crazy talent, and it's like
So
you just know that he's gonna.
I have a comment regarding this. I think
Yeah.
it's nice that these young bache have college degrees and they had immense talent and were able to
pursue
benefit from both, right?
Yeah.
But I think as a society, having that kind of a stringent expectation of young talent might set them up for failure.
Sure,
that
no, I'm
talent
not
might
denying
never
that,
be
yeah.
that talent
Yeah.
might never be realized because we expect
Well,
you
that's
to go
why
to college to get
that's why
degree.
Nusrat Hussain leaves Vital Signs and Junoon and
Right.
goes on to become a pilot.
Right.
That's right.
Didn't you tell me that Junaid Jamshed wanted to leave Vital Signs after the first album to become engineer?
An engineer, yeah. I
mean,
think
he was
it was
already
actually
engineering
after. Yeah, it was after the first one, or maybe the second
So
volume.
it's funny
2.
that they still, after having a tremendous, debut, there's still an option to go and
I think that speaks, and
Pursue it.
that's
Which
to
is nice.
that's
So-
to Omer's point, right? Is that there were these social pressures upon them,
And remember, at that time, maybe it was not.
and frankly, there wasn't that much money to be
Exactly.
made, right?
Oh,
I
there was
mean,
hardly any
even
money.
now, frankly, but I mean, especially back then, there are so many stories that we know
There's
of,
no
of
outlets back
artists
then.
who just migrated to another country because they're like, there's no money to be made here, even though I'm extremely talented,
Correct.
right.
right?
Correct.
Because there wasn't a sort of royalty or copyright sort of like situation, enforcement at least.
I mean, at one
So-
point they just ran out of money.
But
with Vital
my
Signs.
larger point was this, that like I think there have now I think with thanks to Pepsi Battle of the Bands, and I think generally speaking there is still an existing underground scene that still exists in Pakistan, but I love that obviously we're talking about the impact and the influence, and I love that Rohel Hayat and Shah Hassan and whoever like Gumby went on to create these things, Youth Phone Records, whatever, but that really sapped a lot of the sort of individual band scene, right? I mean, just
Yeah.
these like stories of like these guys hanging out, getting together, and being like, you know what, let's just write songs, man, and put
Yeah.
them out there and just go and play shows.
Well, in the
right?
case
And-
of Salman, Junaid, and these guys, they were already doing that underground stuff in colleges and stuff.
Right.
Mid 80s, early 80s.
yeah,
And there's tons of bands that
Lahore
you'll hear
Bindi
about.
circuit,
Like
that was their
Nadeem
circuit.
Farooq writes about, like, where Army Zaki comes from, these underground, and a lot of Christians. These are all underground bands doing, a lot of them were just doing English covers.
right.
And so it took a Vital Signs to turn that and put an Urdu spin on it, make it palatable for that
The
what
masses,
you described as that
yeah.
masses of a Urdu dominant.
Well, not I mean just
Sunni
generally
Muslim
Sunni Muslim, yes, Yeah.
the Urdu
Or the Muslim
understanding.
populace in Pakistan. Yeah.
And then take it to the broader segment. I really want to get into if we have enough time, because we're talking about impact, because this is very important. In BBC did a poll of the most popular songs in the world, and they did this in the late '90s. And I remember this when they came out, that link was being passed around. Because I remember voting for that thing like 10 times myself. I voted for the Pakistan like 10 times.
Right.
So
Well, actually, I have
the
a
Pakistan
story.
ended up in top 3.
I have a story to share. So last year, when I went to the World Cup in England,
Yeah.
obviously, you know,
World Cup.
Little Pakistan is such an identifiable song. I actually wish like some of these stadiums would recognize that there are other songs to play as well when it comes to Pakistan. But I remember walking. I was getting some, you know, whatever they had at every Pakistan match. They would have like halal tikke and biryani and stuff. So you know, just go maze aa rahe the. So I was walking back to the stands, and I saw these 2 white British girls
Yeah.
as the Little Pakistan was playing, because I think right then Pakistan had taken a wicket, and so I took went out for the break or whatever, get some food, and I come back and there's these 2 British white girls that they're not even Pakistani, and they're just like bopping their heads to the Little Pakistan
Can I tell you a story
because
about
it's
that
such a
cricket
classic
stuff?
beat and it's timeless,
Can I,
right?
can I tell you a story about this World Cup that just happened? Salman Ahmed was in UK attending one of the games,
Oh, nice.
and he was tweeting, and then when Little Pakistan was being played, he put on his Twitter that JJ, I hear you, bro.
Yeah.
I read that, I was like, oh shit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Just things that break you down.
Yeah. No doubt. I mean, and there's a there's a legacy and a stamp of that. But the point is that like there was I don't know. There's something about the sort of music that they created that is obviously not just reverberating for Pakistanis, right? I mean, it's
So I
it's a really
think
great song.
at the end, if I were to summarize their impact on music, the band relatively short-lived, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
6 years. I mean, relatively, that's very small.
Because they couldn't figure it out.
Right, and then 4 really great albums, but very short-lived time period. But the lasting impact is not that each individual went on to form their own bands and became frontmen of their own. Like the drummer from Nirvana went on to become the frontman for Foo Fighters, and immensely popular band now, something to that effect. But rather, they all went and established institutions.
Institutions that supported other, that
Exactly.
cultivated.
Exactly. So not only was Vital Signs a seed, it sprouted more seeds that
Right,
would
right. I
then
mean,
it didn't sprout a
Like,
tree.
where would Zulfi be without,
Exactly.
you know?
So I think that's the lasting impact of the band, is that Junaid Jamshed did what he did, even in his religious, when he went around teaching the path that he was on now, and Rohil doing his thing, Shahi doing his thing. So that's the real impact, I think, that we can probably walk away with.
Yeah. I mean, I just to wrap up, I mean, I will say that yes, there's no doubt that there's these lasting impacts that are immeasurable in sort of all sorts of ways. But again, going back to this earlier point, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think it's worth mentioning again, is that especially, I mean, I look at Pakistan and I look at the fact that, politically and economically speaking, it's in the news a lot. But does it carry a lot of influence? I mean, frankly, yeah. I mean, it's an emerging sort of like country power or whatever you want to call it. But I think what's really meaningful is that even those kids, I look back at my cousins and I look back at myself and the impact, and all of us, the impact that Vital Signs had, the memories that we were able to create, the fact that like we felt a connection and a pride, right, in who we were and where we come from and where our parents come from, even if they themselves didn't really care for the music, right? But I look at my cousins who are born, whatever, in the 2000s, late 2000s, who are now like, 10, 11, 12 years old. They've never witnessed that, right? 95 was the last album. They never listened. And they still may never listen, but they know that there's a Vital Signs.
Damn.
They know that there's a legacy. They know that it's Pakistani. And they know that it's revered by generations, right? And that will always last forever. It's almost, and I mean, Tika, like Pakistan's history as a nation state, as a modern nation state, is obviously very new. But I mean, like, it's like the impact that, like I never witnessed the Beatles, right? but I mean, and fine, that's a UK sort of thing, but like they had an impact. But I never witnessed like some of these like classic sort of like bands, right?
Right.
From the 1970s, like Led Zeppelin and
Take
whatever.
take Elvis for example.
Elvis,
I brought
yeah,
him up
exactly.
earlier. I don't know a single Elvis song,
Right.
But I completely.
But you know what an
understand-
icon he was.
Yes, exactly. He's an icon. I appreciate
But,
his
there's
and you,
legacy.
another-
there's an entryway, even if you never want to like read about it, but there's an entryway to understand the social and political context in
Right.
which he arose.
Right.
And Vital Signs provides that entry,
You just
that
brought-
point of
you just
entry,
went
as,
into an area
as
which has
Nadeem
been a very
Farooq's book says.
a
Yeah.
source of major discomfort for me, and I'm gonna just in my portion after this, and then it goes back to we're talking about how we know Elvis. I watched a documentary on Elvis in school, right when I was in 8th grade.
Right.
Documentary on Beatles. That's where I got to know him.
Yeah.
And then it just kills me that we don't have that for Vital Signs and Junoon.
But that's the point though, right? Is that there's an opportunity, and we're part of it, and
we're
I think
doing
all
the
of us
best
can
we
be a
can.
part of that. But imagine that if we just talk about history in a vacuum, frankly, it's not engaging. But imagine trying to sort of convey what the 80s and 90s look like through Vital Signs to a 10-year-old now.
Damn.
Right?
That's the whole point.
And
of
and
music
that's
is.
and that's the beauty of these like iconic figures and bands,
Right.
is that like the title of NFB's book, right? Points of entry, right? It's a
Yeah.
point of entry into inquiring and having a conversation about these things, and that's I think what their indelible impact was. All right, guys. Well, I think that's a wrap.
Exhausted quite a bit of discussion here.
Well, as always, we
Vital
just want
Signs,
to say, give us your thoughts, give us your feedback. Let us know what you think Vital Signs' impact was. You might know a little bit more in terms of their impact on particular artists, their stories with them. As always, hit us up on Facebook. We're gonna keep the conversation going on Vital Signs, but then probably shift to some other scenes, and we're just looking to carry the conversation. Hope you enjoyed this episode.
Until next time, Khuda Hafiz.
All right, everyone. Khuda Hafiz.